Welcome to Module 4, Heat Stress and Confined Space Entry. This course has been designed to be taken individually or to be led by a facilitator who will make connections to your local setting. Anyone who takes the course on an individual basis will be required to have a discussion with their supervisor as a condition to complete the course. By the end of this course, participants should be able to identify the different types of heat stress and their warning signs, determine the actions to alleviate heat stress, recognize the difference between permit-required and non-permit required confined spaces, describe the acceptable conditions for entry into a confined space, as well as the items that must take place prior to entry, identify the responsibilities for each role in a confined space job. Heat stress is an important topic to cover. For some, the warm weather is returning, and for others it may have never left. In some situations, heat stress may not be a danger that would normally be considered as a risk, but it should never be ignored. For instance, working outdoors on a 60-degree day may not seem like much of a threat, but after an employee dons level B protection, the heat will pose a more significant risk. This section will look at heat stress risk factors and prevention methods. Before we get into the symptoms and prevention techniques of heat stress, please define heat stress. Heat stress is when the body gets warm and is unable to cool itself down. Physiologically speaking, under normal conditions, there are two ways the body is able to keep itself cool. First is when blood vessels near the skin's surface expand to release heat. The second is by sweating, which causes the skin to cool as the sweat evaporates. If either of these is insufficient at cooling the body, our core temperature will rise, leading to some form of heat stress. What are some of the factors that contribute to the development of heat stress? One of the most obvious factors of heat stress illnesses would be the ambient temperature. Clean Harbor's heat stress guidelines must be implemented whenever the air temperatures rise above 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. Some other factors that could cause someone to suffer from a heat-related illness include wearing PPE, since it impacts the body's ability to release sweat and body heat. A person who is physically active and in good shape is often better suited to cope with changing heat loads. On a related note, overweight people are more susceptible to heat stress since they often have a higher heart rate. The last reason is how acclimated the employee is to their surroundings, since it takes the body some time to adjust to a warmer environment. Let's take a minute to focus on work that is done somewhere that is very hot. This may be outdoors as well as work in a facility. When you are placed in a situation that is hot, what aspects of working at high temperatures should you concern yourself with? A moment ago, we talked about the factors that contribute to heat stress, but here are others that should raise your awareness to an increased risk of heat stress. As the previous slide mentioned, temperature is a huge factor, and listed on the screen is a heat index chart. But note, the Clean Harbor's heat stress guidelines are implemented at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. In addition to air temperature, the following contributes to the increase in heat load and potential for heat-related illness. Increased humidity makes it difficult for sweat to evaporate. A lack of air movement makes it difficult for sweat to evaporate. The presence of other heat sources like nearby equipment. The lack of controls like fans or air conditioning that are used to reduce the impact of the heat. Also, the more strenuous the work, the more heat the body must manage. While it's good to know the factors that contribute to heat illness, it's even better to know how to protect yourself and your coworkers from heat stress. Please identify proactive measures that need to be in place before working. There are several preventive measures employees can take to protect themselves. In order to prevent dehydration, drink plenty of water and also avoid alcohol and caffeine, since those reduce the body's ability to retain water. As stated previously, a person's physical fitness is a factor in preventing heat stress. In addition to being committed to one's fitness, employees should also eat balanced and healthy meals to ensure that electrolytes lost during sweating are replenished. Like with eating well and being in shape, getting the appropriate amount of rest allows the body to better react to high-temperature situations. When possible, adjust workloads so that higher intensity efforts are done during cooler hours. Last, it is important for everyone to be attuned to the symptoms of heat stress. This aligns directly to the company's fourth golden rule of safety. The previous slide discussed the need to hydrate, which is one of the most critical factors in preventing heat stress. It is important for anyone that is going to be working in a high-heat environment to start hydrating the day before work. Proper hydration happens in 3 steps. First is the pre-hydration stage, which again begins the day before the activity. Next, hydrate during the activity to replenish fluids that are being lost. Last is to rehydrate after the activity to replace the fluids that were lost. Sports drinks are a good option since they provide salts and electrolytes. An effective way to know if you're drinking enough water is by the color of your urine. The darker the color, the greater the chance that you are not drinking enough water, though please note that certain vitamins and medications may impact one's urine color.
Because individuals vary in their ability to handle heat, each person's physical condition should be monitored. 2 reliable measures of physical strain resulting from heat exposure are heart rate and oral temperature. Heart rate is measured by either using digital heart rate monitors or by determining a worker's carotid pulse at the neck. Digital heart rate monitors can be worn either around the worker's chest or wrist. Follow manufacturer's operating procedures when using these items. For the carotid pulse method, locate the pulse, feel at the front of the neck for the Adam's apple, and slide your fingers into the groove next to it in the left side of the neck. Use your index and middle fingers, since the thumb has its own pulse and may interfere with measurements. Using a stopwatch, determine the number of pulse beats in a 30-second period. Multiply the result by 2 to determine the pulse rate for a 1-minute period. An acceptable heart rate should remain below 110 BPM. Oral body temperature is used to estimate the effects of environmental heat and work intensity on the body's core temperature. Heat stress illness should be prevented if body temperature is maintained within acceptable limits. Using a clinical thermometer, if feasible to do so, measure oral body temperature at the end of the work period by placing the thermometer bulb under the tongue for 1 minute before consuming liquids. In most field settings, this may not be practical, so an ear thermometer, requires supply of disposable protective covers, should be made available. A digital temporal scan thermometer is also another option, as it is non-invasive and easy to use in a field environment. Body temperature should be maintained well below 100.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius at all times. NIOSH has established work or test cycle recommendations for workers wearing chemical protective suits. Their recommendation is based on the physical intensity of work, ambient air temperature, and a temperature correction factor to account for impermeable protective clothing. A link to the corporate heat stress standard is located in the resources section of this training course. A thorough explanation of the Humidex tables is provided in the standard. For this course, we will provide a high-level overview. Along the top of the table, the PPE classifications are outlined. There is a separate table for Level D PPE. The table lists air temperatures down the left column of the chart, and along the top of the chart are categories of work. In the grid of the chart, the letter C indicates that continuous work is acceptable for the management of heat stress. When a number appears in the grid, indicates the number of minutes of rest per hour which needs to be provided to employees. The letter A in the grid indicates that the work should be adjusted to a cooler period during the day, or other heat stress control methods need to be included in the work plan. Along the right column of the chart, the amount of water each employee should intake during defined periods of time. The combination of work or rest cycles and water intake should be used to protect our workers from heat stress.
For situations that present the risk of heat stress, it is very important to take breaks so the body can cool itself down. This slide displays the points at which a person should stop or reduce the intensity of their work. Heart rate increases to ensure blood comes into contact with the skin more frequently. This helps facilitate cooling. Once the heat has been regulated, the heart will return to its previous levels. If after a 5-minute break the heart rate does not come down below the 90 beats per minute level, continue to rest until it does. This ensures that the body has had sufficient time to recover from the heat load. The same can be said of the body temperature. Now it is your turn to practice taking your pulse. Remember the importance of doing this when working in an environment that poses the risk of heat stress. There are varying degrees of heat stress. Click each factor at the bottom of the slide for the factor's symptoms, predisposing factors, and first aid procedures. You must click each button before advancing. Heat fatigue is when someone is unable to work at full strength due to the impact of the heat. Often this is a result of less than desirable physical condition and diet. When heat fatigue is present, the person should be removed from heat and allowed to hydrate. In addition, providing more time to acclimate to the environment will provide for better stamina in the heat environment. Heat rash is a skin irritation caused by excessive sweating during hot, humid weather. If a rash is present, the employee should be removed from the heat while allowing the affected area to remain clean and dry. Heat cramps affect people who sweat a lot during strenuous activity. This sweating depletes the body's salt and moisture levels, which results in painful cramps. Heat cramps may occur hours after the heat exposure due to the electrolyte imbalance. They may also be present in someone that is experiencing heat exhaustion. Heat syncope is a fainting episode or dizziness. If someone experiences a fainting or lightheaded episode, find a cool place for them to sit or lie down and make sure they hydrate. Heat exhaustion is the body's response to an excessive loss of water and salt, usually through excessive sweating. If someone displays the symptoms of heat exhaustion, have them go to a cool spot, hydrate, and if possible, take a cool shower or bath. Heat stroke is the most serious heat-related disorder. This is a result of the body being unable to control its temperature. As a result, the body's temperature rises rapidly, the sweating mechanism fails, and the body is unable to cool down. Heat stroke can cause death or permanent disability if emergency treatment is not given. In these situations, call 911. Bring the employee to a cool location and take efforts to cool their body by soaking their clothes with cool water and/or fanning their body. Working in heat is a very strenuous situation, and one that could result in the inability to focus on the job, which subsequently results in an increased risk for accidents or injury. In addition, sweaty palms, fogged-up safety glasses, and dizziness create additional strain. As a best practice, always remember the displayed philosophy and golden rule. In summary, workers who are exposed to extreme heat or work in hot environments may be at risk of heat stress, which can result in heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat cramps, heat rashes, and other injuries. As a result of the significant risk that this may pose, every employee should be aware of prevention measures, situations where heat stress is present, signs and symptoms to look for, and first aid procedures. Now let's transition to confined space entry, or CSE. There are numerous examples of confined spaces at our facilities, branches, and work sites. Although everyone won't perform a confined space entry, understanding what a confined space is and the hazards that they pose are important for everyone. This discussion on confined spaces offers an awareness of their hazards as well as the key requirements for someone that needs to perform a confined space entry.
Specific training should be provided to an employee before an employee enters the confined space. Only appropriately trained employees should enter a confined space. An employee's confined space entry training should be current. Entry cannot be made without having an active confined space entry permit, which should be completed by a Clean Harbors confined space entry supervisor, and entry should be authorized by Clean Harbors Health and Safety. Covering the topic of confined space entry in this module is simple awareness level training. Employees whose job roles include confined space entry work are provided additional levels of training which are outlined in the Clean Harbors Confined Space Entry Standard.
First, define a confined space by focusing on what is needed to classify that space as a confined space. A confined space is an enclosed area with limited space and accessibility. An example is the interior of a storage tank, which may be entered for maintenance but is otherwise an uninhabitable space.
To further expand upon the definition of a confined space, it must meet 3 criteria. First, it must be large enough for a person to enter. Next, the space will present limited or restricted means of entry or exit. And third, it is not designed for continuous human occupancy. Even more restrictive than a confined space is a permit-required confined space. These spaces meet all of the previous criteria, plus have potential hazards associated with them. As required by local regulations, the use of a permit to allow entry into these spaces is required. Please note, this is the United States OSHA definition. Canada provincial regulations may define confined space differently. However, the intent and spirit of the definition is the same.
It goes without saying that a confined space is a hazardous situation. Exact numbers vary from year to year, but there are approximately 90 deaths each year during confined space entry events. This equates to 1 death every 4 days. In addition to the risk for the entrant, approximately 60% of fatalities involve would-be rescuers, and more than 30% of fatalities occur in a space that has been tested and found to be safe to enter. Also, consider how these numbers only deal with fatalities and do not include other injuries that happen during a confined space entry. Take a minute to review the typical hazards listed on the screen and indicate which ones are most common for your confined space entries. Because of the hazards presented with a confined space entry, it is not the job of one person. Please take a moment to define the roles listed on the screen and then click the tabs at the top for an overview of the required roles.
The entry supervisor is responsible for determining whether acceptable entry conditions exist, authorizing the entry, overseeing entry operations, terminating the entry, and canceling the entry permit. The entry supervisor represents the employer and is accountable for entry operation safety. If the entry supervisor is properly equipped, he or she may also serve as an authorized entrant or attendant.
At least one attendant must be present outside the confined space during the entry. The attendant role is frequently seen as a low-grade responsibility that anyone can perform, but in reality, the attendant has more duties listed than either the authorized entrant or the entry supervisor. An entrant is a trained Clean Harbors employee who is authorized to enter a space and is aware of the presented hazards and the measures required to make a safe entry into the confined space.
Rescue personnel are usually made up of members of the confined space crew and are trained annually in rescue techniques and must have current first aid and CPR training. Now that we know what a confined space is and who is involved, The course will focus on some of the requirements for working safely in a confined space. These requirements could address preparations, safety requirements, communication needs, and/or site conditions.
Some of the many action items prior to entering a confined space include the need to assess the space's potential hazards, conduct a safety meeting, and complete a confined space entry permit. Click each tab for an overview of each task. In addition to the hazards posed by the design of the space, work activities can also pose serious safety hazards. This is why a hazard assessment must be conducted to define exactly what the confined space entry team will be exposed to as well as what they will do. The most common hazard is an atmospheric hazard, though there may be hazards due to heat and noise. Additional hazard assessment considerations are displayed on the screen. A safety meeting must be held before conducting a confined space entry as well as prior to the start of a new shift. The meeting will discuss the information that was obtained during the hazard assessment. This includes the hazards of the job, including atmospheric hazards, chemical and physical hazards, and hazards introduced by completing the task. A review of any safety data sheet and work assignments are essential elements of the safety meeting and subsequent safe entry into the confined space. An entry permit is an administrative tool used to document the completion of a hazard assessment for each confined space entry. The information from the permit is listed on the screen, and this information must be discussed with all employees at the safety meeting and will be signed off on as being acceptable. The personal protective equipment used during a confined space entry may be different for each confined space due to the hazards that are anticipated. The conditions for each entry should be reviewed with the respective health and safety manager to determine proper PPE. This decision will consider things like chemical hazards, composition, and the presence of electrical or flammable hazards. Proper PPE will be denoted on the confined space permit and reviewed with the work crew prior to commencing operations, as noted in Section 3 of the Clean Harbors Confined Space Entry Permit.
A thorough and detailed emergency plan must be established and documented in Section 7 of the Clean Harbors Confined Space Entry Permit. This documentation will include the duties of entry and non-entry rescue personnel. This plan will also provide any special procedures for the confined space task.
Because each space is unique and presents some obvious and some less obvious hazards, it is vital that each confined space be assessed to determine the hazards it presents. All of our facilities and branches have tanks, bins, or pits, and each of these areas must have proper signage. Also, any outside contractors or non-facility personnel must be kept away from these areas, especially if a confined space entry is in progress. In addition to posting signage, the space provides other hazards. These are addressed by isolating machinery or equipment prior to entering the space. Prior to entering the confined space, there are several criteria that must be met. Part of the previously described hazard assessment will include an atmospheric evaluation. The displayed atmospheric conditions are Clean Harbors requirements, and they will meet or exceed local regulatory required levels. If any of these levels are exceeded, a permit confined space will not be entered. Also, air monitoring will take place during the confined space entry, and if there is a change in the atmospheric conditions, exit the space and contact health and safety. An effective means of communication is essential during a confined space entry. Specifically, communications must be maintained at all times between the entrant and the attendant. Communication could be visually, vocally, via electronics and/or signals. The most appropriate methods will be determined on a case-by-case basis. In addition to identifying the best way for each person to communicate, as described previously, an emergency plan is also required. This would be used to initiate emergency protocols and assure all information is communicated promptly. To summarize the confined space entry guidelines, As it was just presented, a confined space presents many hazards which must be addressed prior to entering the space. This is addressed by conducting a hazard assessment, completion of a confined space entry permit, completion of an atmospheric evaluation, the identification and mitigation of physical hazards, and isolation of energy and product sources. In addition, there needs to be constant verification with regard to atmospheric exposure, communication, and hazard recognition. Hazard mitigation must be instituted prior to a confined space entry. Click the tabs on this slide for a few examples of hazard mitigation techniques that may be used. Purging is the introduction of a gas to flush the atmosphere of oxygen-deficient or toxic gases, vapor, dust, mists, or fumes. Inerting is the displacement of the atmosphere in a permit space by a non-combustible gas, such as nitrogen, to such an extent that the resulting atmosphere is non-combustible. Entry into spaces that are inert requires specific training and approval by the health and safety manager. Flushing is the introduction of a liquid to the tank with the objective of mobilizing and removing product contained in the space. Mechanical venting is the process of reducing the hazardous atmosphere by introducing or removing air from the space by using a unit solely designed for the purpose of moving air. Mechanical ventilation is required for all confined spaces under Clean Harbor's Confined Space Entry Standard.
As a result of the Clean Harbor's commitment to safety, and because the entry into a confined space is so dangerous, there are guidelines that Clean Harbors requires everyone to follow. This includes having a minimum of 2 rescuers trained in CPR and first aid. When flammable material is encountered, having at least 2 fire extinguishers available for use. There also needs to be equipment to flush corrosive materials from one's eyes and face. In case of an emergency requiring an entry rescue, there are 2 options for retrieval of entrants. The first is with Clean Harbors personnel, and the other is to secure external services before any confined space entry is made.
A confined space rescue can be technically challenging due to the environment in which they occur. The general rule is that after 4 minutes of not breathing, a person in a confined space will likely suffer asphyxia, resulting in either brain damage or death. This duration is less than a minute when inert atmospheres are present. As a result, there is a very limited window to perform a rescue before a serious injury or fatality occurs. Use the tabs at the top of the screen to learn more about the different types of rescue and the required rescue equipment. In a self-rescue, much as the name suggests, the individual recognizes a critical condition or symptoms of exposure and exits the space on their own. Alternatively, an attendant who is outside of the space may recognize a new hazard and order individuals to leave the space before they are affected. This is the preferred rescue method, as confined space hazards can quickly incapacitate or kill an individual. An individual can almost always exit a confined space in far less time than it takes to wait for someone to come in and retrieve them. A non-entry rescue involves rescuers attempting to extricate an incapacitated person without having anyone enter the confined space. This can be done via a safety line attached to the person in the confined space, or by grabbing the person with a rope, strap, or pole and pulling them to safety. This is a last resort option, as having more personnel enter an area that has already incapacitated one or more persons puts the rescuer at considerable risk. Entry rescues must be carefully planned and executed to avoid creating more victims in need of rescue. Rescuers need to be aware of their surroundings and must reevaluate their plans immediately if there is any change in the conditions of the confined space. In the event of an entry rescue, standby rescuers are recommended in the event the rescuers encounter trouble. Due to the unique nature of confined space rescues,
There is specialized equipment necessary to perform a safe and successful rescue. One of the initial pieces of equipment employed in a confined space is a method of ventilation to disperse collected hazardous gases and introduce fresh air into the environment. A full body harness is often the first item to actually perform the rescue. A harness is a synthetic web cloth, or a strap that is used to cinch tightly around the legs and torso of an incapacitated person. The strap is attached to a rope or cable that rescuers use to pull an entrant from the confined space. In the event that an entry rescue must be performed, all rescue personnel will wear protective clothing and use safety equipment appropriate for the situation. This may include a self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, protective headgear, and the use of explosion-proof lighting. The rescuer will also wear a full body harness with an attached safety line. To assist in vertical descents, a mechanical winch and tripod is required to be set up over the access point when the bottom of the confined space is more than 5 feet below the entrance. The rescuers may also carry monitoring equipment by which they can ascertain the quality of the air in the environment. Even if the air quality reading does not indicate any hazardous conditions, it is still required that rescuers wear a self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, or supplied air respirator, SAR.
Agencies that oversee workplace safety require persons qualified for confined space rescue operations to complete rescue training and exercises at least annually, and recommend more frequent training. Earlier, it was mentioned how a permit-required confined space is a more hazardous form of a confined space because it presents additional hazards. In some cases, a permit-required confined space can be reclassified as a non-permit space if the requirements on the screen are met. This effort requires the involvement of a confined space supervisor and health and safety. In Canada, due to regulations, a reclassification cannot be made. Therefore, any entry would be a permit entry. When a reclassification takes place, all workers involved must be advised of the information of the reclassification certificate and must sign off on it. This certificate, just like the permit, is only good for one shift or for the duration of work, whichever is shorter. If any conditions change, all entrants must leave the space and health and safety must be informed.
On March 31, 2018, a fatality occurred when a crew was cleaning clay filter media from a tank at a client facility. Shortly after entering the tower, debris attached to overhead walls fell and engulfed 2 employees inside of the tower, one who ultimately succumbed to his injuries. The tower had been cleaned in the past by members of this same crew. Working under a client-issued work permit, over multiple shifts and crews, employees removed clay media from the lower side manway utilizing gravity and vacuum. Employees worked under recent acquisition standard operating procedures. The material was caked to the side walls of the vessel, impeding free fall of all clay material to the lower part of the vessel. When gravity prohibited additional clay material to fall to the bottom of the vessel, material was knocked off the side walls from the top manway utilizing a steel pole. Ultimately, the client and crew leader determined entry into the vessel was required to remove the additional material adhered to the side of the vessel. A client confined space entry permit was issued to allow interior manual cleaning of the vessel. 2 employees entered the bottom of the clay treatment vessel. One employee stood on an elephant stool covering, used to prevent the outlet from being clogged, while the other stood on the bottom floor. The employee on the stool was manually scraping the material off the side walls while the other was vacuuming material off the bottom of the tank. A large amount of the clay filter media expectantly dislodged from the wall and fell on the 2 employees. The employee standing on the stool was engulfed with the material up to his chin, while the other on the bottom of the tank was completely engulfed by the material. Both entrants had to be rescued from the space by personnel stationed outside of the tank by vacuuming and shoveling. Regrettably, the employee on the lower level passed away due to the extent of injuries suffered as a result of suffocation. Most of this crew was a veteran crew. The hazard evaluation conducted by both client representatives and crew failed to identify the risks associated with debris remaining on the inside walls of the tank. There was a failure to 1. Properly calculate the amount of remaining material adhered to the side walls of the tank. 2. Assess the potential to engulf, and 3. Completely analyze mechanical means to eliminate entry. The clay-absorbent material was unusually caked together and adhered to the walls of the tower. The crew entered the tank under a client-issued permit. In previous cleanings, entry into the vessel was not usually required and it was uncommon for material to adhere to the walls. There was overconfidence of personnel regarding the changing conditions, as well as the potential of rushed conditions to get the job done. This pre-job perceived mindset was evident through comments such as, "I can do it. They want me, he's been doing it for 20 years. I'm in charge." Immediate CSE stand down across entire network discussing hazard awareness while performing entries. CSE permits cancelled and confined spaces reviewed with operations and safety management prior to permits being reissued. Formation of confined space entry, hazard review committee consisting of leadership participants from safety and operations. Multidiscipline committee formed to review all procedures, training, documents, permits, etc. The committee will look to find any potential areas for improvements and implement accordingly. Continued implementation of Clean Harbor Standard CSE guidelines across acquisition employees. Requires a Clean Harbors issued permit in addition to any customer-created permitting requirements. Clean Harbor CSE Standard Operating Procedures explicitly requires completion of a more detailed hazard assessment identifying physical hazards including engulfment potential. Training records for all company CSE supervisors being audited analyzing any potential gaps. Each supervisor will be evaluated by Health and Safety and Operations leadership for their ability to properly manage and abide by CSE standards, protocol and ethics. Each supervisor will be evaluated on their ability to suspend operations and re-evaluate with Health and Safety and Operations upon encountering changes of entry conditions. Each supervisor will be evaluated on their ability to exercise stop work authority even under extreme customer pressure. Creation of I-dashboard. Provides immediate documentation of authorized confined space entry supervisors within the organization. Formation of confined space entry, hazard review committee consisting of leadership participants from safety and operations. Multidiscipline committee formed to review all procedures, training, documents, permits, etc. The committee will look to find any potential areas for improvements and implement accordingly. This is an ongoing corrective action in order to provide guidance, system upgrades, and company standard revisions to the field as a continuing improvement effort.
This module is now complete, and you should now be able to identify the different types of heat stress and their warning signs, determine the actions to alleviate heat stress, recognize the difference between permit-required and non-permit required confined spaces, describe the acceptable conditions for entry into a confined space as well as the items that must take place prior to entry, identify the responsibilities for each role in a confined space job.